All right, hello, grade 11s. I've decided to record this lesson because so many of you are absent. So here we go. So we're coming on to now to page 198. We're going to start with looking at resistance and repression in the 1915s. Resistance, how people opposed apartheid, and repression, how any form of rebellion or even questioning of the apartheid model was savagely put down by the government. And what we're going to be doing, I'm just going to give you a broad overview to start with, and then we're going to go into the specifics as we normally do. So we're looking at the 1950s in particular, and we're looking at the nature of the opposition to the apartheid government. And I'm going to touch on four of the most important points and then go back and do them in a bit more detail. So we're going to start with the Program of Action, which took place in 1949. Program of Action was basically just a document where they decided on a course of action. And up until this point, there'd been almost no meaningful opposition from the ANC, which was an elitist organization. But with the creation of the Council Youth League, or CYL, they decided to up their game. It wasn't full-on violence and confrontation, that would come later, but they did want to create some confrontation with the government. They called for strikes, they called for boycotts, they called for civil disobedience, such as sitting on a whites-only bench. They called for mass protests, the people coming together. They called for passive resistance, resisting the apartheid laws, refusing to carry passbooks, etc., and consumer boycotts, not buying from white stores, for example. So at this stage, there was no response from the government because it was only a program of action. Nothing yet had happened. All right, following that, we come on to the infamous Defiance Campaign of 1952. Planning was done by mainly the ANC, but won some support from the South African Indian Council. They demanded that the 6 of the unjust laws be repealed. Remember, some of them hadn't even been drawn up yet. So this would be the early laws like the 1913 Land Act, the Population Registration Act, the Group Areas Act, the Immorality Act, and the Mixed Marriages Act, for example. The campaign was launched. Volunteers broke apartheid laws in order to be arrested and jailed. They refused to carry passes. They entered through European-only doors. They got onto European-only trains. They wanted the jails to become so overcrowded that the government would have no choice but to remove these laws. Chief Albert Luthuli, who was quite a pacifist, I think we know he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he called off the Defiance Campaign because it was met with such harsh government measures and he feared for the safety of his people. The Council Youth League were not happy at all that he did that. Okay, so the government response, the first thing they did in 1952, the government demanded the resignation of 4 ex-members of the banned South African Communist Party. They refused and were arrested. And government passed 2 laws in 1953 as a result of the 1952 Defiance Campaign. They passed the Criminal Laws Amendment Act and the Public Safety Act. So the Criminal Laws Amendment Act provided for severe penalties for anyone breaking a law in support of a campaign, such as the Defiance Campaign. And the second one, the Public Safety Act, allowed the government to suspend all laws in a state of emergency. And this allowed them to imprison people without trial and really repress any opposition without any recourse of those people going to courts and being prosecuted. Okay, we've spoken about this a few times now, but very, very important document in our history, the Freedom Charter, which was drawn up in 1955. Our present Constitution and Bill of Rights has a lot of its foundation in this document, which was revolutionary at the time. So the Congress Alliance, which we'll talk about, which was the ANC, the South African Indian Council, and SAGPO, or South African Coloured People's Organization, as well as the Congress of Democrats, which was a a whites opposition party. A lot of people ask why they were so segregated. Society was segregated. So by law, Africans, coloreds, Indians, and whites couldn't get together in order to meet. The laws prevented that because of things like the Group Areas Act. So we have a lot of, although the ANC allowed membership outside of race, it was very difficult for them to get together. So there was a meeting of the Congress of the People was held in Kliptown, and they agreed to adopt the Freedom Charter. The charter was a list of demand for the rights that were denied by the government. By the way, they were referred to as charterists, the people who drew them up. So the first response by the government, the Congress was closed down forcibly by the police, and they took the names of all the people present. So it was deemed to be an illegal gathering, and of course it was illegal in the sense that we had all these different race groups, horror upon horror, meeting together. So in the 5 or 6 years that followed, the leaders of the Congress Alliance, 150 people in all, they were all arrested just for drawing up a document. They were accused of high treason, which is plotting to overthrow the state, and the charge of treason carried the death penalty. The treason trial lasted for 4 years, but no one was found guilty as charged. There was obviously insufficient evidence to prove that they were plotting against the state, although the state certainly tried that. And then lastly, the Women's March in 1956. I think you remember in 1956, women were also forced to carry passes, and about 20,000 of them decided to march. Okay, so the greatest challenge to women came from the government's new requirement that women carry passes. FEDSAW, which is the Federation of South African Women, and the ANC's Women's Youth League, which had been recently formed, organized a march to the union buildings in Pretoria. About 20,000 women demanded that the government receive a petition from them. They sung a song, "When you touch the woman, you have struck a rock." Strydom, who was Prime Minister at the time, "You will be crushed." Sorry, that got... The government ignored the protests, and women were forced to carry passes. By 1960, 4 million women had registered for their passbooks. They pretty much couldn't operate without them. Okay, and then there were other forms of protest. Remember, we're only looking at the 1950s. There was the bus boycotts in Alexandra, very similar to Rosa Parks and the bus boycott there. In this case, black people refused to use the state-sponsored buses because of the segregation on them. We have peasant rebellions took place in Zeerust in northwest province, in Skukunaland in the northern province, and Pondoland in the Eastern Cape. Beer raids, brewing of traditional beer was one way in which African women made a living. This was made illegal. It was illegal for them to brew millet beer. This was made illegal in Durban to force African men to drink in the municipal beer halls. Police raids angered them, and there were a number of protests throughout, particularly KwaZulu-Natal, or Natal as it was known then. And in January 1969, policemen were killed in a raid on Cato Manor in Durban. And you can imagine the reprisals from that were immense. So again, all these revolts were forcibly suppressed. Many people were imprisoned, some even sentenced to death. In terms of the Group Area Act, African, Indian, and colored communities were forcibly removed from their homes to racially separate areas. So all of these, what's the word I'm looking for? All of these uprisings eventually resulted in nothing concrete happening, but they were obviously important nonetheless. Okay, we're going to go into a little bit more detail now. So we're looking at after World War II, the 1949 period on. Don't need to tell you by now, in 1948, apartheid started when the National Party came to power. And there was a strong response from the ANC. The ANC Youth League were the ones that drew up the program of action in 1949. And as already stated, they called for boycott, strikes, and general defiance. The youth leaders realized that in order to challenge apartheid, they would need to be more inclusive and work with other anti-apartheid groups. So we're going to talk a bit about that now. The Defiance Campaign of 1952 targeted apartheid laws, particularly Population Registration Act, Bantu Areas Act, and this one I forgot to mention, the Bantu Education Act. Although the campaign was eventually crushed, the ANC had made huge gains in mobilizing the masses. The ANC was now, in the 50s, starting to be seen as the liberation organization amongst black people in South Africa. And then the Africanism of the ANC Youth League. Initially, the ANC Youth League had an exclusive view on Africanisms, i.e., black people themselves must work alone in order to overthrow a system that treated them so badly. They should struggle against apartheid on their own, not in an alliance with others, and they should aim to create a black African state. Anton Lembede, one of the leaders, had strong views that the ANC was for black Africans. However, after leaders like Walter Sisulu, Nelson Mandela, and Oliver Tambo, they gradually moved away from Africanism to more an inclusive acceptance of all South Africans who did not support apartheid. They even worked with the Congress of Democrats, which was a white organization that opposed apartheid. To them, African could now embrace anyone with a commitment to Africa, regardless of the color of their skin. All right, internal resistance before 1960. We've already touched on the program of action. Let's go into some more detail about that. So just to go back a little bit, the ANC resisted segregation in the early days, the 10s and 20s, when they'd just been formed, but it was very non-confrontational. They signed petitions, they sent delegates to the government, they sent delegates to London to protest against the Land Act, which was so unfair. But by 1948, once apartheid had been declared, the African National Congress was forced to adapt more forceful measures to resistance, and particularly the firebrands, as often is the case, the youth, the Congress of Youth League, which wanted to build it into a more confrontational mass resistance movement. So in 1949, the program of action was adopted. We've mentioned boycotts, strikes, non-violent protests, and also the alliances that they formed, various organizations there. And they organized a May Day strike also in 1950, and it was a mass stay away to try and bring the economy to the knees, and by doing that, to force the government to change its political system. 18 protesters were killed in Johannesburg after clashes, and this called for, the ANC called for that, for a national day of protest and mourning as a result of that. Okay, so this is in reaction to the shootings. The ANC called for a national day of protest and mourning. This is a poster trying to get people to stay away. They had the most support in the Eastern Cape and amongst Indian workers in Durban. So in your own time, you can read that. And then the Defiance Campaign. So this is the third major incident. In 1952, various organizations in a joint campaign, very common at that time, of peaceful resistance, called for the Defiance Campaign. Protesters deliberately broke apartheid laws. They used white-only entrances. They refused to carry passes, not to be confused with Sharpeville, which came later. They refused to apply for bail or pay fines, and many spent months in overcrowded jails as a form of protest. The campaign lasted for 3 months, and over 8,000 people were arrested. Again, excuse me, the strongest support was in the Eastern Cape. These tactics drew on the tradition of passive resistance. Most famous person for that was, of course, Mahatma Gandhi. But by now, passive resistance was also starting to be used in the civil rights movement in America. The Defiance campaign turned the ANC into a mass-based organization. It was heading that way anyway, and its membership rose from a mere 7,000 to 100,000 in a very short space of time. And the ANC was joined by, among the groups which joined to form a united front, again, was the Liberal Party, the Congress of the Democrats, both of which had mainly white membership. So again, it's a unification of parties and groups all starting to oppose apartheid. Okay, source B, ANC activists held public rallies to encourage people to join the actions of the Defiance campaign, and many women activists took part in the campaign. Now, I must say, at this stage, the Women's March, women doing speeches, women had a very lowly status in society still, unfortunately. So it was something pretty revolutionary and pretty new. And many African men who were traditionalists didn't want to support the ANC because they promoted the rights of women as well. The strengthening of the ANC by forming alliances, we've touched on this already. So they formed many alliances. They're in an alliance still today with the South African Communist Party and the trade union group COSATU. But in 1953, the ANC proposed a national meeting. It was called the Congress of the People, in which all resistance groups, regardless of color, were invited. The Congress Alliance was formed to coordinate this, and it was these organizations, the ANC, the South African Indian Council, the Colored People's Congress, and the Congress of the Democrats. Later, SACTU joined the South African Congress of Trade Unions, and these people were known as what's the word again? It'll come to me in a second. Excuse me. Okay, this is source C. Campaigners in the Congress Alliance traveled throughout South Africa to listen to people's concerns in order to find out what their concerns were, to draw up a document. This includes rural areas, and so this whole campaign became a national one, not only in the urban areas. And this meeting took place high in the Maluti Mountains, you can see over there. Okay, we're almost there. Local communities collected lists of grievances and demands, which were put together into a document called the Freedom Charter. The word is the people who drew it up were called charterists. And very important date, 26th of June, 1955. The charter was unanimously adopted. Unanimously, everybody voted in the favor by the Congress of People at Kliptown in Soweto. Over 3,000 delegates attended, and representative meetings were held across South Africa. And this is a photo from much later. The Freedom Charter, which was based on demands collected from people all over South Africa. Each clause was passed by the delegates who met at the Congress of the People. This is a photograph showing 30 years later. This is while apartheid was still on, but restriction of information had been largely taken away by then. And this is a group of children in 1985, 30 years later, with a copy of the Freedom Charter, celebrating what it meant for South Africa. Okay, we are almost there. The final document of the Freedom Charter called for a non-racial South Africa, which we do hopefully have today. Human rights had to be upheld. Equal distribution of wealth. Sadly, I don't think we've quite got there yet. Social security and education for all. This commitment to non-racialism became known as Charterism and the foundation of the ANC ideology when they came to power about 50, 60 years later. So we're going to just touch on some of the major points of the Freedom Charter. I'm not going to read them all. When I'm finished, you guys can go back to the Jamboard or your textbooks and do that. Things like the people shall govern, every man and woman shall have the right to vote, man and woman, all national groups shall have equal rights, all people share in the nation's wealth, the land shall be shared by those who work it, all share human rights, equality before the law, There should be work and security for all. The doors of learning and culture should be opened. The same should be spent on everybody's education. There shall be houses, security and comfort. Rents and prices shall be lowered. Let there be peace and friendship. So as I say, when you've got a second, you can read that on your own. And for now, we are not going to be doing activity 1, although we might come round to that.